can start today's presentation. And my name is Christian Hogel. I come from the Center for Medieval Literature, just next door. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Aglae Pizzone, who is an assistant professor here at the Danish Institute of Advanced Studies. So I'm sure many of you already know her. Aglae is a Byzantinist, dealing with Byzantine literature and culture. She is by training a classicist, you would say, a philolog, dealing with language and literature, but she's of the kind that has been sort of moving beyond her original sphere of interest, you could say, or at least approaching all various sorts of methodological and theoretical perspectives on Byzantium and Greek literature in general, not only the Middle Ages, but also in classical times. So originally very much interested in questions of aesthetics, aesthetic approaches to art and such, but moving on then, especially from a Swiss experience to fields of emotion, which is what she will be talking to us about today, but also, and I could continue, but I'll just mention the very major interest in self-commentaries, which means authors or writers commenting on their own works, which is seems to be a medieval, especially a medieval thing in times where no other types of promotion, or few other types of promotion perhaps existed. So one way of making your things known was to comment on them yourself. Now, in this field, she has been approaching other fields of literary studies like Arabic and such. And in general, she's very open to all sorts of methodological issues, which is also a very obvious reason why she could then enter this kind of interdisciplinary sphere, which is the Danish Institute for Advanced Studies. So, with no further ado, please, Aglae.
Thanks. Thank you, Christian, for the nice introduction. Thank you for being here. And today, I'd like to start with a very simple question. What is sadness? I think that you all can relate to this question, but as many simple questions, it has a very complex answer. So, sadness, when we think about the reactions that characterize sadness, we think about features that can be considered universal. Any person in any culture is able to recognize a sad face from very basic features such as eyebrows falling up in the central section and corners of the mouth going down. However, and tears occasionally, let's not forget about tears. However, we are talking here about reactions. Expressions. But reactions and expressions are just one component of emotions. There are other components of emotional states that are less universal and have much more to do with the cultural, social, and I would argue historical context. Especially when it comes to the events, to the antecedents that elicit a given emotion. So this is a standard definition by psychologists of sadness, and we can read it. Sadness tends to be felt when an event is appraised as unpleasant, obstructive to one's goals and concerns, typically caused by others or circumstances, and one feels unable to cope with it or modify it. Its most typical antecedent is the loss of a valued object, often interpersonal in nature. A loved one is dead, a friend moves away, one has conflicts with family, friends, colleagues, or the partner. The loss impinges negatively on attachment and social bonding motives. Sadness is likewise felt, and particularly when losses occur to significant others, even by early childhood, disruption of personal goals and beliefs may also elicit it. So even from this definition, you can see how much culture and societal concerns can affect the event, the emotional event revolving around sadness. The way we interact with our families, or the way we interact with our peers, the goals and the beliefs we have in our life are dictated by the historically determined moment in which we live. So they are not and cannot be universal. And this publication from where this definition is taken. Moreover, it has been proven, when it comes to emotions in general, that cultural factors encourage the development of affective personality traits. There are emotion dispositions that are caused by appraisal biases. That's why we can, for instance, talk about gendered emotions, because social and cultural norms design certain emotions as more likely to be felt by female, for instance. So, this is why all this really matters to me when I look at emotions in history and literature. So, when we talk about sadness and emotion in general, we have to take into account not only the reactions or the expressions, but also the nature of the situation and the subjective experience, the feeling, how the subject assesses and evaluates the event, and other issues such as regulation and control that are again determined by sociocultural factors. So, we can talk, when we talk about sadness, we can talk about a constellation rather than a single emotion. Even more to the point, a very recent study has ascertained that there are two types, basically, of sadness. A sadness, an emotion that is induced by failure to achieve a goal, and an emotion that is induced by the loss of someone. This very recent study has been conducted on 74 participants who have been exposed to an imaginary task evoking sadness. And they have been presented with 3 scenarios of loss, failure, and neutral. And the results of this study are based on subjective ratings, so how the subjects felt about this imaginary task they have been going through. And all the overwhelming majority of the subjects stated that correlated loss with tears, but not with failure. But there are also more objective parameters, such as the electrodermal activity. So our skin is an electric conductor, and emotional events tend to arouse this conductivity. It has been seen in this study that after the task, the electrodermal activity tends to drop more quickly when it comes to sadness related to failure, and it lasts more when it comes to sadness related to loss. Blood pressure is correlated to tears in loss and to intensity of the emotion in failure. So there are both subjective and objective parameters that suggest and point to the fact that sadness elicited by failure to achieve a goal and sadness elicited by loss of a beloved one are two different emotions, or at least subcategories of the modal emotion.
Sorry,
sadness.
just understand. So the loss of someone or failure are technically two different types of emotions.
At least this study shows.
But in terms of intensity, I mean, it's actually they're correlated, or?
The correlation, intensity is more correlated to failure.
Okay.
So
if you fail something, you feel more strongly
yeah,
than if you lose
yeah.
something.
So this is at least what emerges from this study. But as you know, as Christian said, I'm not a psychologist. I'm a literature person, and I work on Greek texts produced in ancient times and in medieval times. So I started from these studies to understand if in the texts I work on, we can in fact detect these two kinds of sadness. And if this is the case, how this difference was put into words. So, the answer to this first question is yes. I think we can detect two different kinds of sadness in pre-modern Greek texts. As a starting point, I'd like to use this text by a 9th century Byzantine patriarch, Phocius, who wrote homilies addressing his audience in Constantinople. Homilies are a very good starting point because the preacher addresses an audience, a real audience, and very often the feelings, the subject addressed in these homilies, religious subjects, are emotionally charged. And a preacher also needs to engage in audience emotionally. So they are a very good place to look for what interests me. This homily in particular is fitting because it's an homily given on the occasion of the Holy Saturday, and it describes the burial of Christ, which is per se a paradoxical moment, because in particular the central character of this homily is Joseph of Arimathea, the guy who took the body of Christ from Pontius Pilatus and took it to burial. It's a paradoxical moment because Joseph is in fact burying someone who is both a god and a man. And Phocius chooses to focus exactly on the mixed feelings that this experience elicits in Joseph. And this gives him the opportunity to describe a wide array of emotions. In this passage, in particular, he first, let's say, lexicalizes these emotions. I mean, he puts forward the emotional words, and then he explains what he meant. So this is very important for us, because he gives us a perspective from within, from a speaker, a medieval speaker, even though, I mean, we are, of course, talking about highbrow literature, so probably this was not the way people actually talked and spoke back then. But nonetheless, it was, this text circulated, so, I mean, they relate to a linguistic reality. So it's very important because it explains to us from a perspective, from a Hindu perspective, what these words meant. So we can read the first part. The subject is Joseph. Flinging himself on the recumbent corpse, he uttered all manner of cries and was divided between every kind of emotion. Everything possessed him at the same time, wonder and dismay, gladness and sorrow, which is rendered here with the Greek term lipe or lipi, according to the modern pronunciation, joy and tears, hatred and pity, fear, cowardice, and courage. His countenance was both of joy and dejection, and this is the term I'll focus on, katepheia. After that, Fortius goes on explaining what he meant by these words. And as you can see, lipi, sorrow, is conflicts with lament, with tears. He wept to see him dead. Tears, on the other hand, are not included in the explanation related to katepheia, which is he was sad for the suffering, he rejoiced, this joy, at his good fortune. So here we have a sadness which is empathic, and in this empathy he relates to the powerlessness of Christ during his sufferings, not to the loss of Jesus. So this is a very important point. Now, let's talk about this word, katepheia. Katepheia has a literal meaning, which is casting the eyes down, so being downcast. Now, here, this literal meaning has been totally lexicalized, which means that the speaker was not aware, or at least fully aware, of the first meaning of the word. It's a very common phenomenon. We are talking about sadness. Do you know where the adjective sad comes from? From the same root of satis, Italian satio, or German satt. So it's something which weighs you down, which makes you heavy. So there is the same spatial component that we have in katepheia, which relates to the more general metaphor that unhappy is down, happy is up. That's why I chose to translate this term with dejection, because dejection renders the idea of this downward movement, which is present in katepheia.
Sorry, and can I ask you, I mean, when actually the sadness itself as a word started appearing? Very, very long. I mean, before the Middle Ages?
It's said it's Old English, in Old English, yeah.
But in Latin, as the first one, what was actually used for sadness?
So in Latin we have triste.
Triste. So that was actually the
word. It's different.
Which is different. Very different.
Yeah. I've not looked into the etymology of the Latin triste or Italian triste. So I just focused on sad because it made a good parallel.
And it's been used since a long time. I mean, sadness in the Anglo-Saxon culture.
Yes.
But it was kind of originally from Latin.
Yeah.
So satio.
Yeah.
So it's actually.
It's from the same root.
So this is so it has to go back to the Roman invasion. I mean, sorry.
Yeah. But I wouldn't know that, so I should look more properly into it. What's that? So, sorry. Okay. Which brings me to the next point of my talk. Why metaphors and metonymies matter. So, katepheia is a metonymic term. Metonymy is a rhetorical figure whereby you express a concept using a part of it. So, in this case, eyes cast down are a reaction pertaining to sadness, and the expression, the term, becomes the word expressing sadness itself. So there is a correlation of effect to cause. So the effect of sadness, casting the eyes down, becomes the cause, sadness itself, in katepheia. Now, these mechanisms are really important because metaphors are not just, as the text says it, a matter of words, but they tell us how we experience the world as embodied beings. So, how we experience the world through our senses, and how also we experience our social and cultural environments. Metaphors usually work as mapping, conceptual mapping of the world, and they are built moving from a source domain to a target domain. I'll give you a very simple example, which is taken from this seminal publication, which introduced the idea of a conceptual metaphor into cognitive and linguistic studies. These metaphors we live by from 1980. So the two authors presented this very simple metaphor. Life is a journey. So in life is a journey, the experience, the spatial and temporal experience of the journey is the source domain, which is then mapped out on the target domain, life, in order to understand the spatial and chronological components of life. Usually this movement goes from concrete experiences, so experiences through the senses, to abstract experiences, abstract concepts, which are then conceptually mapped through the metaphor. Also, metaphors are usually referring to prototypical scenarios, so they are called in linguistics. So ideal scenarios where all the components of the relevant metaphors exist. These prototypical scenarios are very rare to find in practice, but represent a sort of mental scheme that is useful to speakers. Now, metaphor and metonymy are closely correlated, because usually metonymy is the basis of metaphor. We have seen here, for instance, in the case of katepheia, we have this idea of the eyes that are downcast, which is linked to the top-down movement. So sadness, unhappy is down. But this top-down movement is present also in other reactions which pertain to sadness or unhappy feelings. For instance, a drooping posture, and again we have the idea of unhappy is down. Then we can see how metonymy is really the basis from which metaphor arises. The difference, however, is that, as this text says, metonymy is a mapping within the same conceptual domain. So katepheia, the effect of sadness, becomes the cause. We are in the same conceptual domain of sadness. Metaphor is the mapping of one conceptual domain onto another, like life is a journey. And then there are metonymy-based metaphor, which are a category that covers the fuzzy space between the two. Okay, so now let's have clarified my methodological stepping stones. I would say that categoria fits perfectly this bill because, as we have seen, we have an effect that comes to denote the cause, and also we can trace a certain kind of development in the use of the family related to categoria, to dejection in ancient Greek, which shows a development of further metaphorical uses of the word. So, in ancient Greek texts, the abstract noun, katetheia, as well as the adjective katephes and the verb katetheo, so being dejected, always refer to the subject victim of experiencing sadness. In Imperial and Medieval Greek, however, we see a further metonymical shift, whereby the adjective can come to denote entities that are the cause of sadness, life in general, a sad life, a particular object, a sad spectacle, or even another feeling. So we see an evolution over time. So, even though we are dealing here with literary language, this language is not frozen in time, it evolves. Over time, dejection, katetheia, becomes the source domain for metaphorical expressions that indicate weather conditions, inverting the more usual pattern in which an emotion or an emotional mood is weather. So, storming with rage, again, it's a metaphorical expression which is very common, and the emotion here is the weather. On the contrary, in Byzantine Greek, in medieval Greek, we find expressions such as winter is dejected, a cloudy sky is dejected. So there is a kind of inversed metaphor here. When it comes to the way dejection affects the individual, the dominant conceptual metaphor, especially in medieval Greek, is the emotions are fluids in a container. Also, this is a metaphor that we all know from our way to speak. For instance, bubbling with joy or being filled with sadness. And it has its roots in the embodied perception that we are containers. So it's a shared experience of our being embodied in the world. And again, this kind of metaphor is not culturally related, but is to be found cross-culturally. What is interesting, however, is that this development is late. So, being filled with dejection is to be found only in late texts, starting from the beginning of the Christian era. So we have centuries in which Greek authors, and we can imagine maybe Greek speakers, would not use this image. I won't go deeper into that, but I have a theory. It has been seen that in modern English, or the hydraulic notions of emotions as fluid has impacted the way speakers talk about emotions. So I must test this hypothesis, but my idea is that also in Hellenistic and early imperial Greece, this model of the fluids, like the bile causing emotions, became more and more widespread, to the point that it impacted also less characterized usages of the language. So that we see the emergence of these metaphors whereby someone is filled with sadness. But again, this is something I have to test. Let's go back to my first question. Sadness related to failure to achieve one's goals and sadness related to loss. So my hypothesis is that dejection, this katapheia, expresses the idea, has as prototypical scenario, sadness elicited by failure. And to test my hypothesis, I will look at the first instances of the words, which are in Homer, no surprise. Homer, again, is a very good place to start for several reasons, historical reasons. It's considered the first literary text of European literature. It's also the product of oral compositions, so it's really grounded in archaic, in the society of archaic Greece, and it presents really in the narrative prototypical scenarios. So Achilles' wrath, Helen's love. It's a very good place to study the expression of the emotions in a pre-modern.
For a non-humanist, can we call it the first soap opera?
I reject this.
I'm trying to be very provocative, but I remember reading it in school. It felt like a soap opera.
I could settle on the first novel.
Yeah. It's like Dallas.
So, but I mean.
Yeah, we're just discussing about love, betrayal, and things like that. I mean, it's what you still use today.
You name it, you find it. So it's a good place to look. In Homer we have 3 instances of dejection as a noun. The first one I want to consider is in a speech given by Hector scolding Paris for bringing ruin to the Trojan people after abducting Helen. And these are Hector's words. Was it in such strength as this that you sailed over the deep in your seafaring ships, having gathered your trusty comrades, and mingling with foreigners, brought back a fair woman from a distant land, a daughter of warriors, who wielded the spear, but to your father and the city and all the people a great misery. To your fourth a joy, but to yourself dejection. So, at first sight, the concept of dejection here looks close to notions of shame and guilt, with the persons failing to conform to the expected standards being katapheia, being dejection to themselves, or bringing katapheia, dejection, to someone else. This reading seems to be confirmed by the formulaic association with a word that means reproach, onedos, here. And this happens in 2 mirror scenes from the Iliad. We are here in 2 battle scenes. And we have a hero mortally hit by Patroclus, who urges his companions to protect his body after his death, so that his remains be untouched by the Greeks. So it's really we are here again in a situation where there are very strong ethical norms to be respected. Otherwise, he will turn into a token of dejection and reproach to his companions. And takes it, for to you, even in time to come, shall I be a rebuke and a cause of dejection. All your days continually, if the Achaeans strip me of my armor, now that have fallen where the ships are gathered. Later on, in the following book, with the heroes now battling over Patroclus' body, so the killer has been killed, Athena, disguised as Phoenix, stirs Menelaus, another great hero, so as to have him recover Patroclus' remains from the battlefield, lest he bring dejection and reproach upon himself. For you, surely, Menelaus, will it be a rebuke and a cause of dejection if the trusty comrade of lordly Achilles is torn by swift dogs beneath the wheel of the Trojans? So the closeness to shame guilt appears to be strong in these examples. And yet, I would like to argue that dejection refers to a different and probably broader from the typical scenario. First of all, dejection is always retrospective. So there is a crucial point because shame, I cannot go into details, but you have to trust me on this one. Shame is prospective in the poems. It's something that is evoked to prevent someone from doing a bad action. So. Even here in book 16 and 17, where Sarpedon and Athena use the threat of dejection to push the Greeks and the Trojans toward the correct course of action, they do so by representing the consequences of the discouraged behavior. So it's like a thought experiment, but it's not the idea of doing someone which brings dejection. It's having done something that brings dejection. So it's fully retrospective. And also in book 3, when we see Hector talking to Paris, dejection is clearly the unwanted and unforeseen consequence of Paris' choices. In this respect, dejection can be more precisely interpreted as the remorse ensuing from a decision that the subject with insight regards as wrong. So it's a failure in decision making, in my opinion. Not coincident, it's not a chance that dejection always pertains to the individual making the relevant choice. It is the dejection elicited by this failed decision making.
Sorry,
yeah.
In all of this, if you're using English,
yeah.
So if I use another language,
yeah.
There are, different languages, there are different words that you might use. And you limit it by the fact that you're trying to translate in English something that actually maybe not be translatable in English, or it has not enough, vocabulary.
Sometimes yes. In this case, I think that with dejection, I found a good term, but very often this is the case. There are limitations.
Sorry, in New Greek, you still use that?
This is something I forgot to mention.
Yeah.
It means straightforward sadness
okay.
in modern Greek category. So it's fully lexicalized and it's sadness.
So you will use the cause of sadness.
It's the emotion, sadness as emotion. So, yes. So it's totally normal. So I argue that this failure in decision making is a silver thread running through the examples of dejection in the poems, And this is proven, in my opinion, by this passage where we find the adjective dejected. This is a very important passage describing the last phases of Hector's duel with Achilles. Hector knows now that he's doomed, and he realizes that he has no weapon at hand anymore, contrary to his beliefs. So again, a failure in beliefs. And his reaction is being dejected. So and Hector was angered because the swift shaft had flown vainly from his hand, and he stood dejected, nor did he have a second spear of ash. So this is straightforward failure. So really, in its most physical example, someone who misses his target. And again, katetheia is related to beliefs that are proven wrong with insight. Again, is another example from the Odyssey we can gloss over. Is the suitors who believe that Telemachus has died, but contrary to their expectation, Telemachus comes back, and they are dejected. Again, false beliefs. So, I think that really the prototypical scenario in Homer is that of failure in decision making, in abiding by expected social norms, or in beliefs. Now, what really changes in the use of the word, things really change in the use of the word with Aristotle. So, in this treatise on physiognomics, we see katetheia transition from emotion to a trait of character. So, dejection is not elicited anymore by a single event, but is something that stays as a trait of someone who is a psychological type, like the complaining type or the weak and female-like type. So again, it's related to ideas of powerlessness, right? And it will later become also a hallmark of melancholy. But Aristotle is really the first one, and how can we be sure? Well, all the instances of dejection, there are not so many, there are 15 from Homer to the beginning in the text, dating from Homer to the beginning of the Christian era. In all the examples, we see the same usage we find in Homer. So the idea of a failure. The idea of a failure, so much so that a later imitator of Homer, Apollonius Rhodius, who wrote an epic poem in Hellenistic times, uses dejection to gloss the idea of powerlessness, which is rendered in Greek as amechanie. So mechanie has the same root of mechanics, so doing something, accomplish something. It's the inability to accomplish something, and this inability is accompanied by the idea of dejection. Now, my question is, what happens when Christian religion brings about a huge cultural and ideological change on Greek culture? What happens to katetheia, to dejection? Well, interestingly enough, the instances of dejection spring up in this author who is a bit, let's say, borderline between ancient times and ancient culture and Christian culture. Philo was an Hellenized Jew from living in the cosmopolitan Alexandria between the first BC and the first CE. And he used ancient philosophy to explain the Bible, to put it simple, to explain biblical texts. Now, in Philo of Alexandria, we find as many instances of the word as in the whole of Greek literature from Homer to the Christian era. What's interesting is that he always uses katetheia with the term synoia, which is a very interesting term because it's related, it's a compound between syn and same root of nous, mind. So it means literally gathered mind. And it's used to express the idea of anxiety, but also in classical Greek, conscience. So, and it's a cognate term of the term that is used for conscience, synedesis, which again has the idea of syn, collecting, and knowing. It's a verb that expresses a word from a verb that expresses the idea of knowing. In fact, when Philo doesn't use synoia with katetheia, which happens very rarely, just one time, synoia is the awareness of wrongdoing. So it's really conscious. And this affects also the use of katetheia, or the verb katetheo, which is the which translates the awareness of failing in abiding to the expected social rules. So we see here a transition happening. The idea of sadness elicited by failure is, I don't know, both broadened and focused on the idea of failure in being morally righteous. And at the same time is connected with the awareness of it. So it's really related to conscience. And in fact, this is how it's used in the New Testament, where we find it in the letter of James, related to the state of the person who needs to acknowledge that human beings are by essence sinful. Right? And these were the coin flips, in my opinion, because we see that Christian authors build on the original prototypical scenario of sadness elicited by failure, connecting it in a more focused way to moral failure, but in this case, social expectations are different. And so we have also the creation of a new emotional regime in that this sadness becomes the prerequisite to be a good Christian. To acknowledge that human beings are sinful by essence and that they have to atone their sins. Without this sadness, the next step is not possible. And it's not by chance that this dejection is used in the Biblical Commentaries, in these Catena Commentaries. Is a complicated matter, but these were like the handbooks used by preachers in Byzantine times to prepare their homilies, to understand sacred texts. And these commentaries use the idea of dejection to explain the famous passage from the letter to the Romans where Paul talks about the split conscience, his split conscience, about the fact that he knows what good is, but he cannot do it. And he hates what he doesn't do, and he loves what he doesn't do. So, this awareness of this torn conscience, of the inability, again a failure in doing what one knows that he has to do, is explained with dejection. And so that's how Christian thinkers really build on the prototypical scenario that we already see in Homer, 8th century BCE, to create a new emotional regime, and the results can be seen still in the first text we have read, Phocius, 17th century later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aglae. I think I should be taking care of the discussion. So are there questions or comments? Yes, please.
So thanks for the lecture. Now, I mean, as a bit outside the field, right? So
Just a bit.
very much outside the field. I appreciated the differences, right, of the word in different contexts and the history of the word. So, but then what would be the next message, right? I mean, so what? I mean, that's a little bit understood these things. So how can we actually? What's the take-home message of this?
That, I mean, with the flipping meaning, we can see how our own culture as well, because I mean, we much of our culture rely on the New Testament, and was created using categories that already were there, and also that these categories are both culturally determined and, in a way, cross-cultural, since we can see the same differences in sadness as outlined by this study I've mentioned at the beginning. And it helps us understand also, I mean, it raises a whole string of issues also about, how our society values sadness. And if we want to broaden the scenario, I mean, we live in a time, and there have been publications on that, where sadness tends to be erased.
Exactly.
So, whereas, I mean, here we see that, in fact, where we come from, sadness was a positive value, or could be, at least.
That was fascinating. I just have a question about the connection between emotion and metaphor that you raised. But because I know it's not a transparent metaphor here, in that the downward-looking aspect is lost. But I was thinking of a few years ago there was a new dictionary made of the English language, and one of the words that caused a lot of controversy was bitter, because this dictionary was the first created by corpus linguistics, so to reflect actual usage and not what we think words mean. So the primary definition of bitter was resentment. But when I think as an English speaker, what does bitter mean, I kind of have primary meaning would be taste, and then a metaphorical meaning that applies to emotion. And you can make the same with other languages too, like Danish sur, kind of being grumpy or sour, and it works in German as well. But I was just wondering, it's kind of half a question, but I wonder at what point why do we assume that kind of emotion is less universal than up and down or heavy and light, and why does it work that way around?
What do you mean less universal?
We assume that emotion is going to be the quality expressed through a metaphor. Yeah.
Emotion.
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 Yeah, yeah.
Okay. The fact is that, I mean, it's a complicated question in a way, because it raises the issue of what is an emotion. And the model I work with is a multi-component model. So there are like autonomous components which are not conscious in the model I subscribe to, but also context-related components. So I wouldn't say, I mean, some components are universals, as I showed at the beginning, like reaction, expressions of sadness are universal, but what elicits these reactions very often is not, and depends on the cultural context, on your goals, on social norms, on control as well. I mean, so I would say that emotions are universal in some of their components, but not all of them. They do exist, but they exist with different instantiations.
Are the metaphors universal that we use, like it is up and down? Do we see that kind of outside outside of kind of Proto-Indo-European cultures?
Yeah, up and down is
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
You said that sadness had a different importance in Byzantine time based on your study of texts. Now my question is, would a speaker at the time, or a recipient at the time, have actually associated the word with the emotion we call sadness today? And would he not have rather associated it with something like guilt? So is it actually meaningful to talk about sadness in this context here?
Yeah, I mean, guilt can be part also shade associated to sadness, especially when it comes to self-agency. So when the eliciting event is something that is caused by the subject, so guilt goes together with sadness very often. But to answer your question, we can tell it because very often we have, like in the first text I've shown, a couple of opposite words. And this term, dejection, is put together with joy as his opposite. So I wouldn't say that joy can be the opposite of guilt. So it's these kind of examples that we find in the text that help us. Also, there are Byzantine commentaries to Homer, which tell us how the Byzantine would read those texts I've shown to you, and they understood that this was sadness.
Alternatively, is it possible that the use of the word in that particular text here was an attempt of manipulating the audience? So intentionally slightly abusing the word in order to
which text?
I'm sorry, I'm absolutely not in this field. This preacher text.
Yeah, I can tell you that yes, his intention was that of manipulating the audience, but into experiencing this mixture of feelings. That's why in that homily he completely erased the scene of Mary lamenting on Jesus, because otherwise the focus would have been on your sorrow. While he really wanted his audience to focus on the paradoxical feelings elicited by the experience of bearing someone who is both Son of God and man. So yes, I mean, for sure when you read these homilies, they want to create this kind of, it's not really an emotional contagion, but they want to create an emotional community with the audience.
Yes?
I mean, there is this, I mean, from what your definition of sadness came from, right? But more or less of everything that you were also saying before, that a good deal of the words we use perhaps come from describing physical phenomena.
Yes, and also for sadness, I mean, there are, even in English, I mean, there is dejection, there is gloominess, there is sullenness, there are many, many words. Sadness, again, I mean, you know, this you know, opens the warm can of, you know, basic emotions. Again, in the model I work with, we talk about modal emotions that are these basic words, and we talk about the phenomenon of bunching. So bunching is when all these subcategories can be referred to this macro category, which is sadness.
So the point is that given that we get always a more and more deeper understanding of nature, where sometimes we have to borrow, in order to describe it, old words. I give an example, quantum chromodynamics has nothing to do with ordinary color, but because the fundamental forces of holds the quarks inside the protons, but we use color as a, you know, abuse color world to actually describe a new phenomenon. We don't invent a new world, we borrow from the past. And eventually these things then, in 50 years from now, 100 years from now, will basically go back to literature and will probably maybe to explain it as different variation of emotions, right? So to which extent is studied the correlation between, you know, our deeper understanding of nature and actually the way we use words?
That's interesting.
Because after a post-Galileo
sure.
and before Galileo, you know, there are two different way of looking at science, and that has dramatically changed the way we speak.
The fact is that when this conceptual metaphor theory was like introduced for the first time, the focus was on the universal. I mean, people were interested into understanding what was universal in the use of these metaphors. Only more recently, they have, I mean, come to the understanding that metaphors as well are cultural constructs in part. And so there have been diachronic studies, like for instance the one I mentioned on the humors and fluids. And that is an example of how, you know, medical theories, early modern medical theories, affected the way people spoke. So, but I'm not sure there is something on contemporary science.
What's the question here?
So, in general, literature changes the significance of a word, or is the opposite? That
it's a feedback loop, let's say. So it's a mutual interaction, especially when it comes to these medical theories that can become folk theories. So we label folk theories we share in a common parlance, not in a scientific or academic parlance. So folk theories about emotions and like. Feeling down, for instance, is part of folk theory, folk narrative about emotion.
Yeah, I just wondered if you want to include any art studies, because like theater masks and pictures that depict something like sadness.
Yeah.
And is it if it's the same physiognomic?
In fact, I'm part of a project. Emotion Through Time, which wants to do precisely that, to study the evolution. What I did here with this term, with all the range of emotions, looking at textual and visual sources, and our final goal, I mean, is to create also a database containing both text and images that can help to really pinpoint the evolution through time of emotion concepts and can bring into dialogue text people and art people as well. So and the idea is also to provide translations so that also people working on Western Middle Ages can relate to and use the results of our work. So but it's a big project and we are just at the beginning. So also because I mean there are very methodological issues, because when it comes to expressions, there are just so many ways you can translate a given expression into a painting. So very often a single feature can pertain to different kinds of emotional states. And for instance, covering one's head, what's that? Can be many things.
So, perhaps that was the end of questions and comments, but perhaps we should thank Aglae once more.